Hi, Adam here at Twinkl, and to celebrate poetry and all things poetic, I am here with author, poet, and World Slam poetry champion Harry Baker. Hey, Harry.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Very happy to be here.
Nice. It's good to have you. And as you might have guessed, I've got a couple of questions for you about education and poetry mostly, and just what all that sort of looks like for you as a poet at the moment.
Yes.
So, first question. I've heard from quite a number of pupils that poetry is a hard sell. What would you say to that?
I would say I agree with you. I do this for a living. I still find it hard to convince people it's worthwhile. I love it. And I think there is poetry that can speak to everyone. But I think if you're only exposed to a very limited amount, you might think it's not for you. So I know loads of people who have said, children or adults who said, oh, I'm not really that into poetry. Whereas something like stand-up comedy, I think people would find a comedian that they like. And so similarly, I think there is poetry out there for everyone. But for some people, they've had one bad experience of it, and that has put them off forever. So I see where that's coming from, and I would encourage people to try and either listen to or read different kinds of poetry to see which ones speak to you. Because there's loads of poems that I don't get, and that's fine. But there's lots that I do and I love. And I think that if we can be honest enough with ourselves and realize that it's a very subjective thing, then hopefully we can find a way into it for everyone.
That's cracking advice. Not again, just to draw attention to one of your poems. I think the first one I heard was Dinosaur Love, and that immediately for me was a poem that I thought, if I wanted to get people into poetry, this is definitely one that I would show people.
Yeah, and one of my go-to ones in school. I mean, I mostly do stuff in secondary schools, but even in primary schools, I will do that poem, and you can see the kind of surprise, but also the joy from the younger students to think, oh wow, I wasn't expecting this grown man to pretend to be a dinosaur in front of me. But that shift of expectations, I think, is partly what I love about performance, is that you can sidestep what people are expecting poetry to be or expecting you to do. And so I love trying to do that in different ways in my work, and I think loads of other people do that too.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's a cracking poem. So why is poetry important to you?
I think for me, it is the one time I feel like I can be 100% myself. When I'm writing and sharing my work, I feel like I can put everything into it. And it was one of the first times I felt like I found my voice or found a way to express myself. I was quite a shy teenager, but I took the time to craft my words to try and say what I wanted to say as best as possible. And now that I get to spend my days sharing that with other people and seeing how they connect with it, I think it's a really valuable thing. So, I love going into schools because I hope that I can give other people that moment. And actually, as much as you want everyone to enjoy it, I'm often keeping an eye out for the quiet kids at the back who may not be the ones putting their hand up first to come and share their work, but actually just having that space to write stuff down and process it, I think is massive. I think my belief is not every single person should be forced to read their poems out, because that can be a very vulnerable thing to do. And I think it has to come from you. But I think everyone can benefit from writing poetry and from trying to express themselves in that way and seeing what works for them. And I think by the same token, hearing poems or reading poems that can speak to you, that can change the way you see the world. So I think poetry is important because it forces you, or it doesn't force you to do anything, it enables you to see the world differently, or to take a step back from the kind of day-to-day, or see it through new eyes. And I think that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, completely agree. And you've answered my next question so well. I'm going to go rogue and skip to the next one. So you mentioned school workshops about writing poetry. What inspired you to do that?
The first time I did it was because I was asked by an English teacher who had seen my work, and I remembered when I was in year 8, there was a jazz musician that came into our school, and for 45 minutes he played the saxophone in a very impressive way, and then at the end he took some suggestions from the audience and put them into a freestyle rap. And I just thought this was the coolest thing that I'd ever seen, and I was really inspired by it at the same time. And I remember looking back on it thinking, I remembered that more than anything else that happened that year. So I think for me, getting to go into schools, I felt like I'm in such an unfortunate position where I am not seen as a teacher in that same way. So I get to be this outside voice and guest. I get to try and have fun with them, inspire them, get them to do stuff, and then I get to go home and not do any marking. So I'm very grateful for the teachers who put in the day-to-day hard work. But I think for me to be able to be in that space and to give them space to write without it necessarily having to fit any particular form, but to just emphasize the importance of creativity for the sake of it, I think that's such a valuable thing. And I think on a broader scale, we don't give ourselves enough time in our day-to-day to do that. So I love having the chance to go into schools. And when I started going into schools, I used to just replicate a poetry workshop that I'd been to once, thinking I have to do a set number of writing exercises to, you know, justify me being there, because that's how you teach poetry. Whereas these days, it's more about just giving the student space to write and giving them permission to write about something that feels important to them. Because I think, again, if that is where it's coming from, that's going to make you want to give more time to it. So I try and have as much space as I can in those workshops for that creative freedom without it being completely overwhelming, where you're just told to do a poem out of nowhere. So there, you know, there's enough steering to try and get something from it. But I think these days I try and give the kind of workshop that I would want to have, where you're allowed to let your ideas sit and see what happens.
When I taught poetry, sometimes I would try to find a poet that my pupils could relate to. Are there any poets besides yourself, of course, that you would recommend to educators?
Yes, definitely. One of my favorite poets is Holly McNeish, and in terms of being relatable, I just think her work is so obviously from her experience and her life, and she is very funny and political and straight talking. And I think for me, that voice feels very different from maybe what you typically study in the GCSE anthologies. And also I think there's amazing videos of her work. So again, if someone's not sure about if poetry's for them or not, being able to just watch it and experience it and see that firsthand, I think that's a really valuable alternative to reading a stunning poem on a page that you may or may not immediately be able to get your teeth into. So she's someone I would always recommend. And then I think but also I think it is about that variety. So if I've ever got students who are super hesitant about poetry, I would almost use music as a way to kind of get into the idea of lyricism and that. And I think, you know, I grew up as a teenager on hip hop and rap music, and that felt really exciting to me. And actually, when I go into schools, it's often the older teenage boys who are most reluctant to do poetry, but they all love rap music, and there's no connection between the two in their mind. So to be able to share someone like Dave or Stormzy, who, you know, come from this world of grime, but actually in their work have amazing lyricism and talk about vulnerability and real life stuff, and it's not all just the bravado that you might expect with teenage boys loving rap music. There's a real tenderness in there. So I would also look to stuff like that to kind of break down expectations of what poetry is or what lyricism is.